Raymond sat in the back row, hands trembling as he smoothed the wrinkles from his thrift store suit. Around him, parents in tailored clothes laughed and took pictures, while he clutched a handwritten card, the only gift he could afford after 18 years of night shifts and weekend deliveries. His son Kenny stood on that stage in crisp navy whites, about to receive his diploma, unaware of the truth his father had buried for 2 decades. When Raymond applauded, his sleeve rode up just an inch. The Navy Admiral presenting the diplomas glanced at the crowd and froze. His eyes locked on Raymond's wrist, on the faded tattoo barely visible beneath an old watch. The crowd kept cheering, but the Admiral's face had turned pale, his hand suspended mid-handshake with the next graduate. That mark, that specific insignia. The Admiral's breathing stopped for just a moment, because the man wearing it shouldn't be here. Not after what happened all those years ago. The morning had started like any other in Raymond's one-room apartment above the laundromat on 7th Street. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30, same as always, even though he didn't have to work today. 18 years of waking up before dawn had trained his body to reject sleep past that hour. He'd sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the suit hanging on the back of the door, the gray one he'd found at the thrift store 3 weeks ago, spending an entire afternoon searching through racks until he found something that almost fit. The fabric was worn at the elbows, and the buttons didn't quite match, but it was clean. He'd made sure of that, washing it by hand twice, hanging it carefully to dry without wrinkles. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of washing machines below and the occasional car passing on the street. Raymond had lived here for 16 years, ever since Kenny turned 6 and started asking why they didn't have a house like his friends. The answer was simple, though Raymond never said it out loud. Houses cost money. Money he didn't have because every dollar went to Kenny's food, Kenny's clothes, Kenny's textbooks, Kenny's future. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph on the small table by the window, Linda holding baby Kenny, her smile bright and hopeful, taken 3 months before the accident that changed everything. Raymond picked up the photograph, his calloused fingers gentle against the frame. 20 years ago, she'd been everything. His wife, his partner, the person who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. She'd been the one who held him together after he left the Navy, who promised they'd build a life together, who made him feel like maybe he could be more than just a soldier. Then she was gone, and he was left with a 4-year-old boy who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. Raymond had learned to answer that question with truth wrapped in gentleness, but he never learned how to fill the emptiness she left behind. He set the photograph down and moved to the bathroom, where he shaved carefully in the cracked mirror. His reflection showed a man older than 46, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and shoulders that curved slightly from years of physical labor. Gray streaked through his dark hair, more each month it seemed. His hands were rough, scarred from warehouse work and loading trucks and scrubbing floors, honest work, but the kind that left marks. He splashed cold water on his face, letting it wake him fully, then dried off with a threadbare towel. The suit felt strange against his skin when he put it on. He wasn't used to wearing anything beyond his work uniforms, the blue janitor's coveralls, the security guard shirt, the delivery company jacket. This felt like playing dress-up, like pretending to be someone he wasn't. But today wasn't about him. Today was about Kenny. Raymond adjusted the collar, tried to straighten the tie he'd practiced knotting from a video at the public library, and slipped on his only pair of dress shoes. They were old, scuffed at the toes, but he'd spent an hour last night polishing them until they almost looked new. Before leaving, he reached for his watch, the cheap digital one he'd worn for 15 years, the kind that cost $10 at the drugstore. He strapped it over his left wrist, making sure it covered the mark completely. The faded ink beneath had been there for over 2 decades, a remnant of a life he'd left behind. Sometimes he forgot it was there. Other times, like today, it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He pulled his sleeve down over the watch, double-checking that nothing showed. Some things were better left buried. Some chapters needed to stay closed. Raymond locked the apartment door and descended the narrow stairs to the street. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and he walked slowly, careful not to scuff his shoes or wrinkle the suit. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner and exhaust from early traffic. He passed the diner where he'd worked weekends for 8 years, the hardware store where he'd picked up odd jobs, the parking lot where he'd spent countless nights as a security guard. Every building held a memory of exhaustion, of pushing through fatigue to make $1 more, to pay one more bill, to get Kenny one step closer to something better. The bus arrived 10 minutes late, but Raymond had planned for that. He'd learned long ago that nothing in his life ran on time except his own determination. He climbed aboard, paid the fare with exact change, and found a seat near the back. The ride to the Naval Academy took an hour and 15 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively nicer. Houses getting bigger, cars getting newer, until they reached the gates of the campus where his son had spent the last 4 years becoming someone Raymond barely recognized, someone confident, educated, destined for things Raymond had only dreamed about. Getting off the bus, Raymond felt his stomach tighten. Other families were arriving in sleek cars, emerging in groups with flowers and gifts and cameras, mothers in elegant dresses, fathers in expensive suits, siblings dressed like they were heading to a magazine photo shoot. Raymond clutched his handwritten card tucked in his inside pocket, the edges already softening from how many times he'd touched it to make sure it was still there. Inside, he'd written only a few lines, because words had never been his strength. But every word was true. Every word came from the deepest part of him. The campus was overwhelming. Manicured lawns stretched in every direction, buildings stood proud and historic, and the American flag snapped in the breeze above it all. Young men and women in pressed uniforms walked with purpose, their backs straight, their eyes forward. Raymond searched for Kenny among them, his heart hammering in his chest. 4 years ago, when Kenny had received the acceptance letter, Raymond had cried in the bathroom of the warehouse where he worked night shift. Not because he was sad, but because it meant Kenny had done it. Despite everything. Despite growing up in a 1-room apartment. Despite second-hand clothes and free lunch programs and a father who couldn't afford to take him to movies or buy him the things other kids had, Kenny had earned this on his own merit, his own intelligence, his own relentless drive to be better. Raymond found his way to the ceremony hall, following signs and crowds. Inside, the space was enormous, high ceilings, rows of chairs, a stage decorated with Navy banners and the Academy seal. Families were filing in, claiming seats, settling into spots near the front. Raymond automatically moved toward the back, finding an empty row near the wall. He sat down carefully, making sure not to wrinkle his suit any more than necessary, and placed his hands on his knees to stop them from shaking. Around him, conversations buzzed with excitement. Parents talked about internships their children had secured, about graduate schools, about promising careers. Raymond just listened, feeling both proud and impossibly small. A woman in a pearl necklace sat down 2 rows ahead, laughing with her husband about something their daughter had said. A man in a Navy captain's uniform, clearly a veteran himself, settled into a seat near the aisle, nodding to people he knew. Raymond recognized the markers of success, of belonging. He didn't fit here. He knew that. But he was here anyway, because Kenny had sent him a ticket, had called him 2 weeks ago, and said those words that made Raymond's throat tight. "Dad, I need you there. Please. It matters." So Raymond had requested the day off from all 3 of his jobs, had sacrificed the wages he desperately needed, and had come. The ceremony began with music, a Navy band playing something stirring and proud. The audience rose to their feet, and Raymond stood with them, placing his hand over his heart for the national anthem. The words caught in his throat. He'd sung this anthem in different contexts, in different lives, when he'd worn a uniform that meant something different than what it meant now. He pushed those thoughts away. This wasn't about his past. This was about Kenny's future. The graduates began to file in, a sea of white uniforms moving in perfect formation. Raymond's eyes scanned the rows desperately, searching for his son's face. Then he saw him, 3rd row from the front, walking with his shoulders back and his chin up, looking every inch the officer he was about to become. Raymond's vision blurred. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall here. Not in front of all these people. Kenny looked so much like Linda in that moment, the same determined set of his jaw, the same brightness in his eyes. She would have been so proud. She would have been in the front row with flowers and a camera and a smile that could light up the whole room. The Admiral took the stage. Admiral Harrison, according to the program Raymond held in his slightly shaking hands. The man was in his 60s, with silver hair and a chest full of medals, carrying himself with the kind of authority that made people straighten up without realizing they were doing it. His voice was strong, clear, as he welcomed everyone and began to speak about service, sacrifice, and the responsibility these young graduates were accepting. Raymond listened, but his eyes stayed on Kenny, memorizing this moment, burning it into his memory so he could replay it during the long night shifts ahead. The name-calling began. One by one, graduates walked across the stage to receive their diplomas, shake hands with the Admiral, and pose for a quick photograph. Each name was followed by applause, some louder than others, depending on how many family members that graduate had in attendance. Raymond waited, his heart beating faster with each passing minute. Then he heard it, Kenny Cole. His son's name echoed through the hall, and Raymond was on his feet before he realized he was standing. His hands came together in applause, loud and unabashed, not caring if anyone thought he was too enthusiastic or too emotional or too anything. That's when his sleeve rode up. Just an inch. Just enough. The applause was automatic, his arms raised, and the fabric of his old suit, slightly too short in the arms, pulled back to reveal the edge of his wrist. The cheap watch shifted slightly, and beneath it, visible for just a moment, was the faded blue-green of an old tattoo. Raymond didn't notice. His eyes were on Kenny, watching his son shake the Admiral's hand, watching him smile for the camera, watching him become everything Raymond had sacrificed for. But Admiral Harrison noticed. His hand was extended toward the next graduate in line, his professional smile in place, when his gaze swept over the audience in that automatic way people do at public events. His eyes caught on Raymond, on the back row, on the man in the too big suit clapping with everything he had, on the wrist, on the mark barely visible beneath a cheap watch. The Admiral's hand froze mid-reach. His smile faltered. His entire body went rigid, and for a moment he forgot where he was, forgot the ceremony, forgot the hundreds of people watching. That mark. He knew that mark. The Admiral's breathing hitched, his mind racing back through years, through decades, through memories he'd thought were settled and processed and filed away. But they weren't. They never were. And seeing that specific design, that particular insignia, brought it all flooding back with the force of a physical blow. The compound, the ambush, the gunfire, the desperate radio calls, and the man who'd held the line while everyone else got out. The man who'd taken bullets meant for others. The man who shouldn't be here, shouldn't be alive, shouldn't exist outside of that one classified mission report and the memorial service they'd held when no body was ever recovered. The next graduate stood waiting, hand extended, confused by the Admiral's sudden stillness. Someone in the audience coughed. The moment stretched too long, becoming awkward, becoming noticeable. Admiral Harrison blinked, shook himself slightly, and forced his attention back to the ceremony. He shook the graduate's hand, smiled mechanically, and handed over the diploma. But his mind wasn't on the stage anymore. His eyes kept darting back to that spot in the back row, to the man who'd sat down again, who'd pulled his sleeve back down, who was wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, like he was trying to hide the fact that he was crying. The ceremony continued, but the Admiral barely registered it. He went through the motions, shaking hands and smiling and saying congratulations, but inside his head was chaos. Was it possible? After 19 years? After they'd all assumed the worst? After the official reports had listed him as killed in action? After the funeral with the empty casket? After all of it? The Admiral had been a lieutenant commander then, 30 years old and terrified, pinned down in a compound with 11 other men while enemy forces closed in from every direction. They'd called for extraction, but the helicopter couldn't land, and someone had to hold the entry point long enough for the team to move through the building and reach the alternate extraction point on the roof. Petty Officer Raymond Cole had volunteered. Not volunteered, insisted. The Admiral remembered the look in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he'd checked his rifle and taken position at that doorway without hesitation. The Admiral had ordered him to fall back once everyone was through, had made him promise. Cole had nodded, and then he'd held that position, firing with mechanical precision, dropping targets with the kind of cold efficiency that came from years of training and an absolute refusal to fail. The team had made it to the roof. The helicopter had come, and the Admiral had been the last one to board, had turned back to look for Cole, had seen him still at that doorway, still firing, blood spreading across his uniform. They'd called for him, screamed for him. The Admiral had tried to go back, but hands had pulled him onto the helicopter. Voices had shouted that it was too late, that they had to go. The last thing he'd seen was Cole dropping to one knee, his rifle still raised, still fighting even as the building swarmed with hostiles. The extraction had been chaotic. They'd barely made it out, and when they'd circled back hours later with reinforcements, the compound was empty except for bodies. Cole's body wasn't among them. The official determination had been killed in action, remains unrecovered. The Admiral had written the letter to Cole's family himself, had folded the flag at the memorial service, had carried the weight of leaving that man behind for 19 years, and now he was here, sitting in the back row of a graduation ceremony, wearing a suit that didn't fit, clapping for someone named Kenny Cole. The Admiral's hands were shaking as he handed out the last few diplomas. His mind was racing through possibilities, explanations, scenarios. Was it really him? Could it be someone else with the same tattoo? No. That design was specific, unique to their unit, inked by a particular artist in a particular town outside their base. There were only 14 men who bore that mark, and 12 of them were accounted for. One was confirmed dead in a different operation, and one had been Raymond Cole. The ceremony ended with more music. With closing remarks, the Admiral delivered from muscle memory rather than conscious thought, with the graduates throwing their caps in the air and the audience erupting in applause. Families surged forward to find their graduates, to take pictures, to celebrate. The Admiral stepped off the stage, his mind made up. He had to know. He had to be sure. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his eyes scanning for that old suit, that gray fabric, that man who'd been crying in the back row. Raymond was trying to make his way toward the stage, being jostled by the crowd, apologizing when he bumped into people. He felt out of place, too slow, too awkward, not sure how to navigate this sea of celebration. Then he saw Kenny pushing through toward him, still in his uniform, his face split in the biggest smile Raymond had ever seen. Father and son met in the middle of the chaos, and Kenny threw his arms around Raymond without caring who saw, without caring that his father's suit was cheap or that they were probably blocking traffic. "Dad, you came," Kenny said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you would, but seeing you here, it means everything." Raymond hugged his son tight, one hand on the back of Kenny's head like he used to do when Kenny was small and scared. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," Raymond said. "I'm so proud of you, so proud." They stood like that for a long moment, the crowd flowing around them, until Kenny pulled back and wiped at his eyes. "Come on. There are some people I want you to meet. My classmates have been asking about you." But before Kenny could lead him away, a voice cut through the noise. "Excuse me." The voice was firm, commanding, impossible to ignore. Raymond and Kenny both turned to find Admiral Harrison standing there, his face pale, his eyes locked on Raymond with an intensity that made Raymond's stomach drop. The Admiral looked like he'd seen a ghost. "May I have a word, sir?" The question was directed at Raymond. Polite, but not really a request. Raymond's first instinct was to refuse, to make an excuse, to leave before this went any further. But Kenny was looking at him with confusion, and the Admiral was already stepping closer, his gaze dropping to Raymond's wrist where the watch sat. "That watch," the Admiral said quietly. "May I see what's beneath it?" The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of authority, of certainty, of someone who already knew the answer but needed confirmation. Raymond felt the blood drain from his face. His hand instinctively covered his wrist, pulling the sleeve down further. "It's nothing, sir. Just an old watch," but his voice betrayed him, shaking slightly, lacking conviction. The Admiral's eyes softened, and he took another step closer, lowering his voice so only Raymond and Kenny could hear. "Please, I need to see it. Because if you're who I think you are, then I've spent 19 years believing you were dead." The words hung in the air between them. Kenny looked from the Admiral to his father, confusion turning to concern. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Raymond closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Admiral Harrison, and something passed between them, recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement of a shared past neither had spoken about in years. Slowly, Raymond reached for his sleeve. His fingers fumbled with the fabric, and Kenny moved to help him, rolling the sleeve up with gentle hands. The watch came into view first, cheap and practical. Raymond unclasped it with hands that trembled, letting it fall into his palm, and there, on the inside of his left wrist, was the tattoo. Faded with age and sun exposure, the lines no longer as sharp as they'd once been, but unmistakable. The Navy SEAL trident, the unit number beneath it, the date of their deployment, the mark of a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. Admiral Harrison stared at it like it was a religious artifact. His hand came up slowly, hovering over the tattoo without touching, as if contact might make it disappear. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Petty Officer Cole, Raymond Cole, you're alive." Raymond nodded once, unable to speak, his throat too tight. The Admiral's eyes filled with tears, and he didn't bother to hide them. "My God, all these years. We were certain that you..." The Admiral couldn't finish. He looked at Raymond's face, really looked, seeing past the age and the weariness and the cheap suit to the young man who'd saved his life 19 years ago. The same eyes, the same set of the jaw when facing something difficult, the same quiet strength that had always defined Raymond Cole, even when he was bleeding out in a doorway halfway around the world. The Admiral's professional composure cracked completely. He straightened to attention and saluted Raymond with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the fallen. Raymond stood there, frozen, not knowing how to respond. He hadn't been saluted in almost 2 decades. He wasn't military anymore. He was just a janitor, a security guard, a delivery driver. He was just Kenny's dad. But muscle memory took over, and he returned the salute, his back straightening, his hand crisp despite the trembling. For a moment, they were both back in that compound, young men facing impossible odds, brothers in the way only combat could forge. The Admiral lowered his hand and suddenly pulled Raymond into an embrace, something completely against protocol but necessary in this moment. People around them were starting to stare, to whisper, to pull out phones. Kenny stood to the side, his face a mask of confusion and dawning realization, watching his father be hugged by one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy like they were long-lost family. Because, in a way, they were. When the Admiral pulled back, his hands gripped Raymond's shoulders. "Operation Desert Hawk, November 2003. You held that entry point for 7 minutes. 7 minutes of hell while we got to the roof. You took 3 bullets. I saw you go down. We called for you, but there were too many of them, and the helicopter couldn't wait." His voice broke. "I've carried the guilt of leaving you behind for 19 years. I wrote to your family. I spoke at your memorial service. And you've been alive this whole time?" Raymond's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "I was alive. Barely. Woke up in a military hospital 3 months later. By then, Linda was already gone. Car accident while I was overseas. Kenny was 4 years old, staying with neighbors. He needed a father more than the Navy needed another broken soldier. So I took the discharge, took my son, and started over. Tried to, anyway. But why didn't you reach out? The Admiral asked, genuinely bewildered. Your benefits, your medals, the men who wanted to thank you. You just disappeared. Raymond glanced at Kenny, who was listening with wide eyes, hearing a version of his father's story he'd never known existed. Because none of that mattered, Raymond said simply. All that mattered was making sure Kenny had a life, that he had opportunities, that he didn't grow up knowing his dad was too broken to take care of him. I did what I had to do. The Admiral shook his head slowly, processing this. You gave up everything. Your career, your benefits, your recognition. For him. He looked at Kenny, understanding dawning in his eyes. Kenny, still in shock, found his voice. Dad, you never told me. All those years, I thought I didn't know you were. His words failed him. Raymond turned to his son, his eyes pleading for understanding. It didn't matter what I was. It only mattered what you could become. But you were a hero, Kenny said, his voice rising slightly, drawing more attention from people nearby. You saved lives. You nearly died. And you never said anything. You let me think you were just... He stopped himself, realizing how that sounded. Raymond's expression didn't change. I was just your dad. That's all I needed to be. And you made it here anyway. You earned this, Kenny, on your own merit. That was the whole point. The Admiral was looking between them, seeing the full picture now. The sacrifices, the quiet strength, the 18 years of minimum wage jobs and second-hand clothes, and never complaining because it was all for this moment, for this young man in a Navy uniform who'd made it despite everything. The Admiral's voice was thick when he spoke again. You've been working 3 jobs to support him. For 18 years. Raymond nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. Lots of people work hard for their kids. Nothing special about it. Nothing special, the Admiral repeated, almost to himself. Then his face hardened with determination. Petty Officer Cole, you earned a Purple Heart for those wounds. A Bronze Star for your actions that day. You're entitled to full military benefits, medical care, disability payments. You never filed for any of it. Raymond shrugged. Didn't feel right. I left. I made that choice. The Admiral's voice was firm. That wasn't a choice. That was you continuing to serve, just on a different front. And it's not too late. The benefits are still yours. Back pay, everything. Raymond started to protest, but Kenny cut in, his voice stronger now. Dad, you have to accept it. Please. You've given up enough. Raymond looked at his son, saw the determination there, the same fierce stubbornness that had gotten Kenny through 4 years of the academy. For you, Raymond said quietly. Not for me, for your future, so you don't have to struggle like I did. Kenny's eyes filled with tears. You never had to struggle alone, Dad. I wish you'd told me. The moment was interrupted by other graduates and families starting to crowd around, having caught snippets of the conversation, seeing the Admiral's emotional reaction. People were pulling out phones, whispering questions. A few other officers approached, drawn by their commander's unusual behavior. Admiral Harrison realized they were becoming a spectacle. This isn't the place for this, he said. Raymond, Kenny, would you come to my office? There's much more we need to discuss, privately. They followed him through the crowd, Raymond feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt since those days in the hospital when he'd first learned about Linda. Kenny walked beside him, their shoulders touching, a silent show of support. The Admiral led them into a building and down a quiet hallway to an office with his name on the door. Inside, he gestured to chairs, closed the door, and stood for a moment with his back to them, collecting himself. When he turned around, his face was composed, but his eyes were still wet. I need to tell you something, the Admiral began, looking directly at Raymond. That day, in that compound, I was the last one out. The last one you saved. I'd been hit, bleeding from my leg, couldn't move fast. You physically threw me toward the stairs, told me to go. You knew what staying meant. You knew they'd overrun that position, and you did it anyway. Raymond's voice was quiet. You had a family. I'd seen the picture in your vest. Wife and 2 kids. I was single then. It made sense. The Admiral shook his head vehemently. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. You don't measure the value of a life like that. But you did. You made that calculation in a split second and decided I was worth more than you. His voice cracked again. I've built a career on the foundation of your sacrifice. I've raised those kids. They're in college now. I've lived 19 years you should have had. Raymond interrupted gently. I had my years. Different ones than I expected, maybe. But I had them. I had Kenny. I got to watch him grow up, even if I couldn't give him everything I wanted to. I was there for his first day of school, his basketball games, his graduation from high school. I was there. That was my life, and I don't regret it. The words were simple but filled with absolute conviction. Kenny spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you ever tell me? About the Navy? About what you did? Raymond turned to his son, his weathered face gentle. Because I didn't want you to think you had to live up to something. Didn't want you to feel like you owed anyone anything. You made it here on your own, Kenny. Your intelligence, your determination. That's all you. Not me. But everything I am is because of you, Kenny said fiercely. Every opportunity I had, you gave me. Every time I wanted to quit because it was too hard, I thought about you working 3 jobs and never complaining. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see how tired you were, how your hands hurt, how you'd skip meals so I could eat? I noticed everything, Dad. Everything. And I made it here because I wanted to make you proud, to prove that your sacrifice meant something. The room fell silent, except for the quiet sound of 3 men trying not to break down completely. Admiral Harrison cleared his throat. I'm going to make some calls. Get your paperwork started, Raymond. Your service record needs to be updated. Your benefits need to be processed. And there's something else. He paused, considering. This academy has a program for veterans, particularly those who've sacrificed for others. We provide counseling, support, mentorship. I'd like you to be part of it. Help other single parents, other veterans trying to navigate civilian life. Your story, your strength, it matters. Raymond looked uncertain. I'm not a hero. I'm just a dad who did what he had to do. That's exactly why your story matters, the Admiral insisted. Most people will never face combat, but every parent faces the daily battle of providing for their children, of sacrificing their own needs for the next generation. You did both. You served your country in war and in peace. That's worth recognizing. Kenny reached over and took his father's hand, something he hadn't done since he was small. Please, Dad, let people help you for once. Let them see what I've always seen. Raymond looked at his son, saw the pleading in his eyes, the love, the desperate need for his father to accept that he was worthy of support. Finally, Raymond nodded. Okay, for Kenny. Always for Kenny. The Admiral smiled, a real smile this time. There's one more thing. Next month, we're having a ceremony for distinguished alumni and guests. I'd like you to be there, to be formally recognized, to meet the other men you saved that day. 2 of them are still active duty. 4 are retired but local. They all think you're dead, Raymond. They all carry the weight of losing you. Let them know you survived. Let them thank you. The thought terrified Raymond, but he found himself nodding again. The walls he'd built around his past were crumbling, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Exposed, vulnerable, but also, for the first time in 19 years, seen. Really seen for who he'd been, not just who he'd become. Kenny squeezed his hand. I'll be there with you, Dad, whatever you need. Raymond squeezed back, drawing strength from his son the way he'd drawn strength from the thought of his son for nearly 2 decades. They talked for another hour, the Admiral making notes, asking questions, filling in gaps in the story. He learned about Raymond's life after the Navy, the struggles, the minimum wage jobs, the tiny apartment, the constant juggling of bills and responsibilities. He learned about Kenny's childhood, about the scholarship that had been a miracle, about the pride Raymond carried for his son that far outweighed any pride he might have felt for his own military service. And with every detail, the Admiral's respect deepened, his determination to right this wrong growing stronger. When they finally left the office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the campus. Other families had cleared out, the celebration over, everyone heading to dinners and parties. Raymond and Kenny walked slowly toward the bus stop, neither in a hurry to end this day despite how emotionally exhausting it had been. Kenny was still in his uniform, and he kept glancing at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. "You know what's funny?" Kenny said after a long silence. "I always thought I wanted to be strong like the heroes I read about. Guys who won medals and got their names in history books. I never realized the strongest person I knew was already right next to me." Raymond's throat tightened. "You are strong, Kenny. Stronger than I ever was. You didn't need me to be a hero. You just needed me to be your dad." "You were both," Kenny said quietly. "You just didn't make a big deal about it." They reached the bus stop and sat on the bench, watching the last light fade from the sky. Raymond felt different than he had that morning, lighter, somehow, despite the weight of memories that had been dredged up. The secret he'd carried for so long was out, and instead of the disaster he'd feared, it had brought something unexpected. Connection, recognition, a chance to help others the way he'd helped his son. The bus arrived, and they climbed aboard. Kenny insisted on paying the fare, a small gesture of care that Raymond accepted with grace. They sat together near the back, Kenny's head eventually drooping to rest on Raymond's shoulder as exhaustion caught up with him. Raymond looked down at his son, his graduate, his officer, his entire world, and felt a profound sense of completion. This was what he'd worked for. This moment. This peace. 1 week later, Raymond stood in front of a mirror again, but this time, it wasn't in his tiny apartment. He was in a hotel room, courtesy of the Navy, preparing for the ceremony Admiral Harrison had arranged. Kenny was with him, helping him adjust the tie, a new one this time, proper and matching the suit the Navy had provided. It fit perfectly. Raymond still felt uncomfortable in it, but less so than before. He was getting used to the idea that he was allowed to occupy space, to be seen, to be honored. The tattoo on his wrist was visible now. He'd stopped covering it with the watch, stopped hiding it like a shameful secret. It was part of his story, part of who he was, and denying it hadn't made him any less of that person. Kenny caught him looking at it and smiled. "It looks good on you, Dad. Like it belongs." Raymond managed a small smile back. Maybe it does. The ceremony was held in a formal hall on the academy grounds. Raymond had expected something small, private, but when he walked in, he found nearly 200 people, officers, veterans, families, and press. His steps faltered, and Kenny steadied him with a hand on his elbow. "You've got this. Just breathe." Admiral Harrison met them at the entrance, looking proud in his full dress uniform. "Ready?" he asked Raymond, who very much was not ready but nodded anyway. They made their way to the front, where chairs had been set up facing a small stage. As Raymond passed through the crowd, people stood, not just out of politeness, but in genuine respect, watching him with expressions of gratitude and admiration. Raymond kept his eyes forward, focusing on not tripping, on not embarrassing himself or Kenny. They reached their seats, and the Admiral stepped onto the stage, calling the room to attention. "Today," Admiral Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the space, "we gather to correct an injustice 19 years in the making. We gather to honor a man who epitomizes the values we hold most sacred: service, sacrifice, putting others before oneself. Many of you know the story of Operation Desert Hawk, a mission that went sideways. 12 men trapped, extraction impossible, odds insurmountable. One man held the line so the others could live. We thought he'd died doing it. We mourned him. We memorialized him. We were wrong." The Admiral gestured toward Raymond. Petty Officer Raymond Cole survived that day, though gravely wounded. He survived months of recovery, and then he made a choice. Faced with being a single father to a young son, he chose to leave the military and dedicate himself entirely to raising that child. For 18 years, he worked multiple jobs, lived in poverty, and gave everything so his son could have opportunities he never had. Last week, I watched that son graduate from this academy with honors. And I watched Raymond Cole sit in the back row in a suit from a thrift store, having sacrificed even the day's wages to be there, crying with pride for what his son achieved. The Admiral's voice grew stronger. That is service. That is sacrifice. That is heroism in its purest form. And today, we acknowledge it. He nodded to someone off stage, and a group of men walked out. Raymond recognized them immediately, though they'd aged as he had. His unit, the men from that mission. They lined up on stage, standing at attention, their eyes locked on Raymond. Each face told a story of years lived, of families raised, of careers built on the foundation of that one terrible, beautiful day when they'd all survived. Admiral Harrison continued, "These men have asked for the opportunity to say something." The first man stepped forward, an older now but still fit, with gray at his temples. "Raymond Cole, I'm Captain Lewis Baker. You threw me down those stairs when I hesitated. Pushed me so hard I dislocated my shoulder. I hated you for it in that moment. I've thanked God for it every day since. I have 3 daughters because you made me live. Thank you." One by one, they spoke. Short statements, voices breaking with emotion, stories of children and grandchildren, and lives that existed because Raymond had refused to let them die. Raymond sat there, tears streaming down his face, unable to respond, overwhelmed by the weight of their gratitude. Kenny sat beside him, crying too, gripping his father's hand like a lifeline. When the last man had spoken, Admiral Harrison called Raymond to the stage. Raymond's legs barely cooperated, but Kenny helped him up, whispered encouragement, and Raymond somehow made it to the front. The Admiral opened a wooden box lined with velvet. Inside were the medals Raymond had never received. The Purple Heart for his wounds, the Bronze Star for valor, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, each one a symbol of a past Raymond had tried to forget, now returned to him with honor. As the Admiral pinned each medal to Raymond's chest, he spoke quietly, just for Raymond to hear. "You've already received the greatest honor any man can have, the love and respect of your son. These are just medal and ribbon, but you've earned them twice over. Once for that day, once for every day since." Raymond couldn't speak, could only stand there and accept what was being given, feeling unworthy and overwhelmed and strangely at peace. The ceremony concluded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People approached Raymond afterward, veterans wanting to shake his hand, parents wanting to tell him their own stories of sacrifice, journalists wanting interviews. Kenny stayed close, running interference when it got too overwhelming, protective of his father in the way Raymond had always been protective of him. They'd reversed roles somehow, and it felt right. Later that night, back in Raymond's apartment, they sat together in the quiet. The medals were laid out on the small table beside Linda's photograph, catching the dim light. Kenny picked up the Purple Heart, turning it over in his hands. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" he asked quietly. Raymond didn't hesitate. "She already was, from the moment you were born, and everything after, that was just bonus." Kenny set the medal down carefully. "What about you? Are you proud of yourself?" Raymond considered the question. "I'm proud of you. That's enough." Kenny shook his head. "That's not what I asked." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, then finally said, "I did what I thought was right. I made the best choices I could with what I had. If that's worth being proud of, then maybe. Yeah, maybe I am." Kenny smiled, that bright smile that reminded Raymond so much of Linda. "Good. Because I'm proud of you, and you can't stop me." Raymond laughed, a real laugh, feeling something in his chest loosen. "Okay, I won't try." They sat in comfortable silence. Father and son, 2 men who'd been through their own wars and come out the other side scarred but whole. The following month, Raymond started his work with the Veteran Support Program. He met with single parents, with veterans struggling to adjust, with people who felt lost between their military identity and civilian life. He spoke quietly, without drama, sharing his own story when it helped and listening more than he talked. He discovered he was good at it, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood the questions, the fear, the doubt, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy that came with trying to be enough for someone who depended on you completely. Kenny finished his initial training and received his first assignment. Not far from home, through what Raymond suspected was Admiral Harrison's influence, but Kenny insisted was his own merit. They saw each other regularly, falling into a new rhythm. Raymond cut back to 2 jobs instead of 3. The veteran benefits finally processed, and providing a safety net he'd never had before. He even bought a new watch, but he didn't cover the tattoo anymore. Let it show. Let it be part of his story. One evening, Raymond returned to the academy for a sunset walk, something he'd started doing when he needed to think. He found Admiral Harrison there too, standing by the water, hands in his pockets. The Admiral saw him and nodded a greeting. "Mind some company?" Raymond asked. Admiral Harrison smiled. "I'd welcome it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light change over the water, each lost in their own thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said," Raymond finally spoke, "about how you built your career on my sacrifice." The Admiral tensed, but Raymond continued. "It's not a burden. It shouldn't be. You took the life I helped save and did something meaningful with it. You've led thousands of sailors, made decisions that kept people safe, raised good kids. That's not guilt. That's the point. That's what makes the sacrifice worth it." The Admiral's voice was thick when he replied. "I never thought of it that way." Raymond shrugged. "Took me 19 years and my son graduating to figure it out myself. But yeah, that's how I see it now. We save who we can. We do our best with the life we get, and we hope it matters." The Admiral nodded slowly. "It matters, Raymond. What you did then and what you did after. It all matters." They stayed until the sun fully set, 2 men bound by a moment neither could forget, finding peace in the understanding that sacrifice wasn't an ending but a beginning. That heroism wasn't always loud or recognized, but it was always present in the quiet choices people made every day. To keep going, to keep trying, to give everything for the ones who needed it most. Raymond walked back to the bus stop alone, his steps steady, his shoulders straight despite the ache from years of hard labor. He thought about Kenny, probably at his base now, learning and growing and becoming the officer Raymond knew he could be. He thought about Linda, hoping she could see what their son had become. He thought about the men from his unit, living their lives, loving their families, carrying forward the gift of survival. And he thought about himself no longer just the man in the back row, no longer invisible. Seen, valued, at peace. The bus arrived, and Raymond boarded, finding his usual seat near the back. As they pulled away from the academy, he looked out the window at the campus, disappearing into the evening. 20 years ago, he'd been a different person. 10 years ago, he'd been too exhausted to think beyond the next shift. But tonight, he was just Raymond Cole, father, veteran, survivor. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.